What if the cruelest torture wasn't pain, but silence? No bars, no blood, just a locked room, an empty table, and a man, slowly unraveling. This is Chapter 2 of Chess Story by Stefan Zweig, and if you're ready, step into the void. McIver did as he was told. The succeeding maneuvers between the two men, we others had long since become mere supernumeraries, consisted of a back and forth that we were unable to comprehend. After some 7 moves, Czentovic looked up after a period of silence and said, "Draw." For a moment, a total stillness reigned. Suddenly, one heard the rushing of the waves and the jazzing radio in the adjacent drawing room. One picked out every step on the promenade outside and the faint, thin susurration of the wind that carried through the window frames. None of us breathed. It had come upon us too abruptly, and we were nothing less than frightened in the face of the impossible, that this stranger should have been able to force his will on the world champion in a contest already half lost. McIver shoved himself back and relaxed, and his suppressed breathing became audible in the joyous "ah" that passed his lips. I took another look at Czentovic. It had already seemed to me during the later moves that he grew paler, but he understood how to maintain his poise. He persisted in his apparent imperturbability and asked in a negligent tone, the while he pushed the figures off the board with a steady hand. "Would you like to have a third game, gentlemen?" The question was matter-of-fact, just business. What was noteworthy was that he ignored McIver and looked straight and intently into the eyes of our rescuer. Just as a horse takes a new rider's measure by the firmness of his seat, he must have become cognizant of who was his real, in fact, his only opponent. We could not help but follow his gaze and look eagerly at the unknown. However, before he could collect himself and formulate an answer, McIver, in his eager excitement, had already cried to him in triumph, "Certainly, no doubt about it, but this time you've got to play him alone. You against Czentovic." What followed was quite extraordinary. The stranger, who curiously enough was still staring with a strained expression at the bare board, became affrighted upon hearing the lusty call, and, perceiving that he was the center of observation, he looked confused. "By no means, gentlemen," he said haltingly, plainly perplexed. "Quite out of the question. You'll have to leave me out. It's 25 years since I sat at a chessboard and I'm only now conscious of my bad manners in crashing into your game without so much as a 'by your leave.' Please excuse my presumption. I don't want to interfere further." And before we could recover from our astonishment, he had left us and gone out. "But that's just impossible," boomed the irascible McIver, pounding with his fist. "Out of the question that this fellow hasn't played chess for 25 years. Why, he calculated every move, every counter move 5 or 6 in advance. You can't shake that out of your sleeve. Just out of the question, isn't it?" Involuntarily, McIver turned to Czentovic with the last question. But the champion preserved his unalterable frigidity. "It's not for me to express an opinion. In any case, there was something queer and interesting about the man's game. That's why I purposely left him a chance." With that, he rose lazily and added in his objective manner, "If he or you gentlemen should want another game tomorrow, I'm at your disposal from 3 o'clock on." We were unable to suppress our chuckles. Every one of us knew that the chance which Czentovic had allowed his nameless antagonist had not been prompted by generosity, and that the remark was no more than a childish ruse to cover his frustration. It served to stimulate the more actively our desire to witness the utter humbling of so unshakable an arrogance. All at once, we peaceable, indolent passengers were seized by a mad, ambitious will to battle. For the thought that just on our ship, in mid-ocean, the palm might be wrested from the champion, a record that would be flashed to every news agency in the world, fascinated us, challengingly. Added to that was the lure of the mysterious, which emanated from the unexpected entry of our Savior at the crucial instant, and the contrast between his almost painful modesty and the rigid self-consciousness of the professional. Who was this unknown? Had destiny utilized this opportunity to command the revelation of a yet undiscovered chess phenomenon? Or was it that we were dealing with an expert who, for some undisclosed reason, craved anonymity? We discussed these various possibilities excitedly. The most extreme hypotheses were not sufficiently extreme to reconcile the stranger's puzzling shyness with his surprising declaration in the face of his demonstrated mastery. On one point, however, we were of one mind to forego no chance of a renewal of the contest. We resolved to exert ourselves to the limit to induce our godsend to play Czentovic the next day, McIver pledging himself to foot the bill. Having in the meantime learned from the steward that the unknown was an Austrian, I, as his compatriot, was delegated to present our request. Soon I found our man reclining in his deck chair, reading. In the moment of approach, I used the opportunity to observe him. The sharply chiseled head rested on the cushion in a posture of slight exhaustion. Again, I was struck by the extraordinary colorlessness of the comparatively youthful face, framed at the temples by glistening white hair. And I got the impression, I cannot say why, that this person must have aged suddenly. No sooner did I stand before him than he rose courteously and introduced himself by a name that was familiar to me as belonging to a highly respected family of old Austria. I remembered that a bearer of that name had been an intimate friend of Schubert, and that one of the old emperor's physicians in ordinary had belonged to the same family. Dr. B was visibly dumbfounded when I stated our wish that he should take Czentovic on. It proved that he had no idea that he had stood his ground against a champion, let alone the most famous one in the world at the moment. For some reason, this news seemed to make a special impression on him, for he inquired once and again whether I was sure that his opponent was truly a recognized holder of international honors. I soon perceived that this circumstance made my mission easier, but, sensing his refined feelings, I considered it discreet to withhold the fact that McIver would be a pecuniary loser in case of an eventual defeat. After considerable hesitation, Dr. B at last consented to a match, but with the proviso that my fellow players be warned against putting extravagant hope in his expertness. Because, he added with a clouded smile, I really don't know whether I have the ability to play the game according to all the rules. I assure you that it was not by any means false modesty that made me say that I hadn't touched a chessman since my college days. Say, more than 20 years, and even then, I had no particular gifts as a player. This was said so simply that I had not the slightest doubt of its truth, and yet I could not but express wonderment at his accurate memory of the details of positions in games by many different masters. He must, at least, have been greatly occupied with chess theory. Dr. B smiled once more in that dreamy way of his. Greatly occupied. Heaven knows it's true enough that I have occupied myself with chess greatly. But that happened under quite special, I might say unique, circumstances. The story of it is rather complicated, and it might go as a little chapter in the story of our agreeable epoch. Do you think you would have patience for half an hour? He waved towards the deck chair next to his. I accepted the invitation gladly, There were no near neighbors. Dr. B removed his reading spectacles, laid them to one side, and began. You were kind enough to say that. As a Viennese, you remembered the name of my family. I am pretty sure, however, that you could hardly have heard of the law office which my father and I conducted, and later I alone, for we had no cases that got into the papers, and we avoided new clients on principle. In truth, we no longer had a regular law practice, but confined ourselves exclusively to advising, and mainly to administering the fortunes of the great monasteries, with which my father, once a deputy of the clerical party, was closely connected. Besides, in this day and generation, I am no longer obliged to keep silence about the monarchy. We had been entrusted with the investment of the funds of certain members of the Imperial family. These connections with the court and the church, my uncle had been the emperor's household physician, another was an abbot in Zeitenstetten, dated back 2 generations. All we had to do was to maintain them. And the task allotted to us through this inherited confidence, a quiet, I might almost say a soundless task, really called for little more than strict discretion and dependability. 2 qualities which my late father possessed in full measure. He succeeded, in fact, through his prudence, in preserving considerable values for his clients through the years of inflation, as well as the period of collapse. Then, when Hitler seized the helm in Germany and began to raid the properties of churches and cloisters, certain negotiations and transactions, initiated from the other side of the frontier with a view to saving at least the movable valuables from confiscation, went through our hands, and we too knew more about sundry secret transactions between the Curia and the Imperial House than the public will ever learn of. But the very inconspicuousness of our office, we hadn't even a sign on the door, as well as the care with which both of us almost ostentatiously kept out of monarchist circles, offered the safest protection from officious investigations. In fact, no Austrian official had ever suspected that during all those years, the secret couriers of the Imperial family delivered and fetched their most important mail in our unpretentious 4th-floor office. It happened that the National Socialists began, long before they armed their forces against the world, to organize a different, but equally schooled and dangerous army in all contiguous countries, the Legion of the Unprivileged, the Despised, the Injured. Their so-called cells nested themselves in every office, in every business. They had listening posts and spies in every spot, right up to the private chambers of Dollfuss and Schuschnigg. They had their man, as alas, I learned only too late, even in our insignificant office. True, he was nothing but a wretched, ungifted clerk, whom I had engaged, and on the recommendation of a priest, for no other purpose than to give the office the appearance of a going concern. All that we really used him for was innocent errands, answering the telephone and filing papers. That is to say, papers of no real importance. He was not allowed to open the mail. I typed important letters myself and kept no copies. I took all essential documents to my home, and I held private interviews nowhere but in the priory of the cloister, or in my uncle's consultation room. These measures of caution prevented the listening post from seeing anything that went on. But some unlucky happening must have made the vain and ambitious fellow aware that he was mistrusted, and that interesting things were going on behind his back. It may have been that in my absence one of the couriers made a careless reference to His Majesty instead of the stipulated Baron Fern, or that the rascal opened letters surreptitiously. Whatever the reason, before I had so much as suspected him, he managed to get a mandate from Berlin or Munich to watch us. It was only much later, long after my imprisonment began, that I remembered how his early laziness at work had changed in the last few months to a sudden eagerness when he frequently offered, almost intrusively, Almam to post my letters. I cannot acquit myself of a certain amount of imprudence, but after all, haven't the greatest diplomats and generals of the world, too, been outmaneuvered by Hitler's cunning? Just how precisely and lovingly the Gestapo had long been directing its attention to me was manifested tangibly by the fact that the SS people arrested me on the evening of the very day of Schuschnigg's abdication, and a day before Hitler entered Vienna. Luckily, I had been able to burn the most important documents upon hearing Schuschnigg's farewell address over the radio, and the other papers, along with the indispensable vouchers for the securities held abroad for the cloisters and 2 archdukes, I concealed in a basket of laundry which my faithful housekeeper took to my uncle. All of this, almost literally in the last minute, before the fellow stove my door in. Dr. B interrupted himself long enough to light a cigar. I noticed, by the light of the match, a nervous twitch at the right corner of his mouth that had struck me before, and which, as far as I could observe, recurred every few minutes. It was merely a fleeting vibration, hardly stronger than a breath, but it imparted to the whole face a singular restlessness. I suppose you expect that I'm going to tell you about the concentration camp, to which all who held faith with our old Austria were removed, about the degradations, martyrings, and tortures that I suffered there. Nothing of the kind happened. I was in a different category. I was not put with those luckless ones on whom they released their accumulated resentment by corporal and spiritual degradation, but rather was assigned to that small group out of which the National Socialists hoped to squeeze money or important information. My obscure person in itself meant nothing to the Gestapo, of course. They must have guessed, though, that we were the dummies, the administrators and confidants of their most embittered adversaries. And what they expected to compel from me was incriminating evidence. Evidence against the monasteries to support charges of violation by those who had selflessly taken up the cudgels for the monarchy. They suspected, and not without good reason, that a substantial portion of the funds that we handled was still secreted and inaccessible to their lust for loot. Hence their choice of me on the very first day, in order to force the desired information by their trusted methods. That is why persons of my sort, to whom they looked for money or significant evidence, were not dumped into a concentration camp, but were sorted out for special handling. You will recall that our Chancellor, and also Baron Rothschild, from whose family they hoped to extort millions, were not planted behind barbed wire in a prison camp, but, ostensibly privileged, were lodged in individual rooms in a hotel, the Metropole, which happened to be the Gestapo headquarters. The same distinction was bestowed on my insignificant self. A room to oneself in a hotel sounds pretty decent, doesn't it? But you may believe me that they had not in mind a more decent, but a more crafty technique, when, instead of stuffing us prominent ones in blocks of 20 into icy barracks, they housed us in tolerably heated hotel rooms, each by himself. For the pressure by which they planned to compel the needed testimony was to be exerted more subtly than through common beating or physical torture, by the most conceivably complete isolation. They did nothing to us. They merely deposited us in the midst of nothing. Knowing well that of all things, the most potent pressure on the soul of man is nothingness. By placing us singly, each in an utter vacuum, in a chamber that was hermetically closed to the world without, it was calculated that the pressure created from inside, rather than cold and the scourge, would eventually cause our lips to spring apart. The first sight of the room allotted to me was not at all repellent. There was a door, a table, a bed, a chair, a wash basin, a barred window. The door, however, remained closed night and day. The table remained bare, of book, newspaper, pencil, paper. The window gave on a brick wall. My ego and my physical self were contained in a structure of nothingness. They had taken every object from me, my watch, that I might not know the hour, my pencil, that I might not make a note, my pocket knife, that I might not sever a vein. Even the slight narcotic of a cigarette was forbidden me. Except for the warder, who was not permitted to address me or to answer a question, I saw no human face. I heard no human voice. From dawn to night, there was no sustenance for eye or ear or any sense. I was alone with myself, with my body, and 4 or 5 inanimate things, rescuelessly alone with table, bed, window, and basin. One lived like a diver in his bell, in the black ocean of this silence. Like a diver, too, who is dimly aware that the cable to safety has already snapped and that he never will be raised from the soundless depths. There was nothing to do, nothing to hear, nothing to see. About me, everywhere and without interruption, there was nothingness, emptiness without space or time. I walked to and fro, and with me went my thoughts, to and fro, ever again. But even thoughts, insubstantial as they seem, require an anchorage if they are not to revolve and circle around themselves. They, too, weigh down under nothingness. One waited for something from morn to eve, and nothing happened. Nothing happened. One waited, waited, waited. One thought until one's temple started. Nothing happened. One remained alone, alone, alone.